Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this is the second video in a series looking at the disproportionate authority people give to Jon Krakauer's account of the 1996 disaster because he was there. It is extremely rare for a definitive account of a major disaster to be written by one of the survivors. For instance, the definitive account of the sinking of the Titanic, A Night to Remember, was written by Walter Lord, an attorney born 5 years after the Titanic sank. Other disasters have no survivors at all. For instance, the book The Perfect Storm is a story about the 1991 sinking of the Andrea Gale. That book, categorized as creative non-fiction, was published roughly 1 month after Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air. A notable parallel is that Sebastian Junger also wrote an article for Outside magazine about the 1991 sinking after years of research. His article, The Storm, was published in Outside magazine in the October 1994 edition, and it would be almost 3 more years before the book, The Perfect Storm, was published. In contrast, Krakauer has admitted that he turned in the manuscript to Into Thin Air in December 1996 after having worked on the actual writing of the book for just 3 months. Having spent just 3 months on the book, it should come as no surprise that Into Thin Air is riddled with inaccuracies, inconsistencies, and outright fabrications. Immediately after turning in the manuscript, Krakauer headed off on a 2-month expedition to Antarctica, where he claims he barely even thought about Everest. In this video, I will contrast Krakauer's hastily written account with that of Lou Kasischke's, whose After the Wind was published in 2014, though Kasischke does claim he wrote most of the pages during 1997 and 1998. So let's start with a high-level overview of Lou Kasischke's account, titled After the Wind, 1996 Everest Tragedy, One Survivor's Story. Kasischke's book really consists of 2 parts. The first is telling his personal story of what he saw on the mountain, and the second is his analysis of events he did not witness, and for that he largely relies on Krakauer's version of things. Kasischke highlights what is different with his book as follows. My perspective and analysis were also different from much of what was written and reported at that time, particularly the relative importance of things. Too much was written about things that were colorful for storytelling, but did not matter. Kasischke's personal account spends significant time discussing Rob Hall's operation and how things worked down at base camp. If you think Rob Hall was this top-level logistical planner and just happened to get unlucky when his team got caught in a storm, Kasischke's account will set you straight. Rob Hall is disorganized and over-promising and under-delivering. Kasischke falls just short of calling Rob Hall's operation a bait-and-switch, when he was told that experienced guides Ed Viesters and Guy Cotter would be guiding the expedition. Kasischke had even put it into his written contract that they would be the guides, only to be told a couple weeks before the expedition that Cotter and Viesters would not be the guides. For some of the information that Kasischke didn't personally know, unfortunately he copied that from Krakauer without checking it, and he thus makes the same mistakes as Krakauer. For instance, Kasischke claims Michael Groom was 33 years old at the time, the exact same mistake that Krakauer made. Groom was born in 1959, as described in his book Sheer Will, and clearly stated in the Himalayan database. Curiously, Krakauer has not issued a correction relating to Groom's age, but this is not surprising, as legitimate journalists are the ones that admit their mistakes and issue prompt corrections. Kasischke also got other things wrong, for instance claiming 28 people climbed above South Summit when records in the Himalayan database show only 24. Thus, I do not rely on any of the things that Kasischke did not personally witness. It is also clear that Kasischke had not read Michael Groom's book, as Groom answers many of the questions Kasischke poses in his book about why the guides did certain things. Most notably, Groom answers why they did not initially fix the ropes above South Summit, and that is because Rob Hall told them to wait there for his go-ahead. For the items that Kasischke witnessed, these differ significantly from the reporting from Krakauer. In these instances, there are significant biases between Krakauer and Kasischke's account. I'll also take a look at Groom's version of the same items, and you can see if you can spot the various biases or spin Krakauer applied in his narrative. Let's start with this description of Stuart Hutchison, as this was an item that Julie Rack picked up on in her book False Summit. In False Summit, Professor Rack levels the exact same criticism about Krakauer that I am outlining here, namely that Krakauer shaped a narrative to such an extent that it is difficult to consider it accurate, much less fair, unbiased, or remotely journalistic in nature. You can read that entire chapter in her book, but it comes to this conclusion. It should be clear by now that Krakauer's contention that he wrote his narrative based only on facts, as a journalist would, is not accurate. particularly in his portrayal of climbing experience, which also exhibits considerable gender bias. Getting back to how Krakauer describes Stuart Hutchinson, a climber on Rob Hall's adventure consultants team, Krakauer writes, "A high-strung, self-serious young man from the upper crust of English-speaking Montreal society. He was a brilliant medical researcher who went on a big mountaineering expedition every 2 or 3 years, but otherwise had little time for climbing." And compare with Groom's account. "It was then that I met the first of our 8 members, Stuart Hutchinson. I took an immediate liking to the tall, handsome Canadian who was working in the USA as a cardiologist. His considerable mountaineering experience had seen him on Broad Peak, Denali, K2, and the north face of Everest." And Kasischke's account. "Rob said he wanted Stu as part of the expedition because of his 15 years climbing experience in the Himalayan and Alaskan range. He had been on 3 Himalayan expeditions to the north face of Everest, K2, the world's second highest mountain, and Broad Peak, as well as many difficult climbs in the Alaskan range and summiting McKinley, Denali, 2 times, and once on the more challenging West Rib route. This was Stu's second attempt on Everest. He aborted his first attempt in 1994 to help rescue another climber." Now, Kasischke is mistaken about K2 and Broad Peak being in the Himalayan. They are in the Karakoram. In addition, Hutchinson's first attempt of Everest was on the north side of Everest, not the north face, as I'll describe shortly. I point out these mistakes to show that all authors make mistakes, and you have to look at them to determine whether they are honest mistakes or part of shaping a narrative. Here, I view these errors as honest mistakes, as they don't either advance or detract from the key elements of the story. And Kasischke never contended that his book was this highly fact-checked journalistic telling of events. With those mistakes aside, it is difficult to reconcile Kasischke and Groom's account of Hutchinson's having 15 years of extensive experience, including 2 summits of Denali, with Krakauer's version that Hutchinson had, quote, little time for climbing. For Hutchinson's first attempt on Everest in 1994, this was on the north side. Hutchinson was climbing with Russell Bryce's team, which initially intended to climb the couloir to the east of the North Ridge. They aborted at 7,800 meters and switched to the standard route when, just days later, a Canadian, John McIsaac, on a completely different expedition, became incapacitated and needed assistance getting down. Fortunately, McIsaac was climbing with his expedition's doctor, and having significant medical experience with high-altitude climbing, the doctor chose to give up his emergency oxygen and descend to high camp, where he would pick up an additional oxygen bottle and warm himself in the tent so that he could then render assistance. Other expeditions heard about this and stopped their own summit bids to assist, with even Chantal Maudit assisting, as well as Stuart Hutchinson. But any story that has a medical professional descending ahead of a stricken climber so he can warm himself in the tent to better assist is not going to be reported by Krakauer. Nor did Krakauer mention the numerous clients, not guides, who had no obligation to help but still chose to assist in the rescue efforts. That Stuart Hutchinson was one of those clients, and that Krakauer couldn't even be bothered to make a passing reference to it, shows his bias. Of course, Krakauer did mention Chantal Maudit's problems in 1995, but he made no mention of her assisting in the 1994 rescue efforts. Just more of his bias. Also of note in the 1994 reports are that the Canadian expedition made use of emergency reserve oxygen bottles. That is, each climber carried a small bottle weighing just 2.75 kilograms or about 6 pounds for emergency use. And this was directly credited with allowing McIsaac to descend from the 3rd step. It also allowed one climber to very easily assist another climber by giving them a small amount of oxygen. Now, the doctor, Dennis Brown, attempted to do this. He left his small bottle at the 1st step, but McIsaac was unable to locate it on his descent. The importance of this is that backup and emergency oxygen systems were in use well prior to 1996, a key fact ignored by Krakauer in his assessment of Rob Hall's system as being, quote, state-of-the-art, as will be discussed shortly. One would think that experience on Broad Peak, Denali, K2, and an unclimbed route on Everest would make one qualified for the Southeast Ridge standard route. But we have this anecdote from Julie Rack that illustrates the problem of the false faith people place in Krakauer's narrative. Hutchinson, too, will be described as an inexperienced bumbler, so much so that years later he complained that Krakauer's portrayal of him as a novice climber meant he became part of the story of Everest's commercial decline despite the evidence. For the next 5 years, people would come up to me and say, well, you didn't deserve to be there because you'd never climbed before, because that's what they'd read. When I tried to explain that actually I had quite a bit of experience beforehand, they would say, no, you didn't. And this is a recurring problem with any discussion of the 1996 disaster, and that is Krakauer supporters have this bizarre insistence that Krakauer's account is accurate. His fans make up this type of subcult similar to fans of Ayn Rand, and anything Krakauer says is taken as gospel, and Krakauer caters to these non-critical fans. In his various chapters he made in response to my videos, he ignores key facts and misrepresents things that he would know that myself or any other critical viewer would catch. Stuart Hutchinson was a victim of this unquestioning faith in Krakauer, and this issue was pointed out to Krakauer. In an interview published in May of 1997, Krakauer was responding to a question about his complaining about how inexperienced the climbers were. Krakauer: some of my teammates and members of other groups have taken me to task for saying that more than a few were woefully underprepared and unskilled. In the client's own view, they were experienced. One teammate, for example, was reduced to a helpless infantile state by his infirmities and needed extensive help to make it down to the South Col. And yet he doesn't seem to remember this. His view that he was just fine, that he didn't need any help. First, it's not clear which client this is referring to as being incapacitated. Krakauer never once mentioned this in any of his numerous different written versions of what happened that day. Second, whether someone became incapacitated and confused about whether they were incapacitated has nothing to do with how experienced they were. There is this classic dispute between Hobler and Messner. Hobler wrote on page 118 of Everest, Impossible Victory, describing their night on South Col on the descent. Throughout the night, Reinhold screamed with pain, sobbing and crying. He implored me again and again, "Don't leave me alone, Peter, please. You must stay with me. Don't go. Don't climb down alone without me." You see, he was naturally thinking of our agreement, that if one of us became ill, then the healthy partner must try to save himself. But for me, there was no question of this. "I won't leave you alone, Reinhold. Please believe me. I'll stay with you, and we'll go down together. We'll manage that. Don't worry. Eric will help us." Now, Messner does not recall being incapacitated, but that has nothing to do with either Messner nor Hobler's experience. The same deflection technique is commonly used by Krakauer. In his 8 so-called chapters that supposedly responded to my videos, he will quote some portion of my video and then go off on a similar tangent that ultimately just quotes from his own book, and then he says the issue has been categorically debunked without ever having actually ever addressed the criticism. And that is exactly the same thing he did in that interview response. People had their lives altered by Krakauer's portrayal of them as inexperienced. Krakauer's response is that there was some anonymous person who Krakauer claims was incapacitated, and who Krakauer also claims thought he was not incapacitated, and somehow all of this proves that everyone else was inexperienced. There are so many problems with Krakauer's statement in that interview that I will have to break it out into its own video. For now, let's move on to the oxygen equipment. Krakauer's version. The state-of-the-art Russian-built oxygen system used by Hall consisted of a stiff plastic oxygen mask of the sort worn by MiG fighter pilots during the Vietnam War, connected via rubber hose and crude regulator to an orange steel and Kevlar gas canister. And Kasischke's. Rob's ancient system was not designed for mountain climbing, an aggressive, hard-breathing situation. The modern mask system used by the other expeditions in 1996 were much more advanced. Now, based on the photographic evidence, Kasischke's account is correct, and Krakauer's is not factually accurate and also contains biased puffery. As you can see in this photo of Michael Groom and Andy Harris wearing the supposedly state-of-the-art fighter mask, shows that they are not even hard plastic. You can apparently purchase Vietnam-era MiG fighter masks on eBay, and they look nothing like the ones Rob Hall used. The closest I could find would be this one, but even it does not have the top strap and is clearly molded in a different fashion. But even if the mask were some type of surplus mask from the Vietnam War, it's difficult to see how this would qualify them as being state-of-the-art. Scott Fisher's team used the same version, and it appears the choice was based on the low price and interchangeability rather than having the latest and greatest technology. The masks were too large, creating a large dead space, and did not seal properly with the face, allowing exhaled air to fog up your goggles. As seen on Andy Harris, they required a top strap over the head to hold the thing in place. As I will get into in an upcoming video, it is likely that the ill-fitting nature of these ancient masks was what caused Jasko Namba to be so slow to climb the Hillary step. Given the one-size-fits-all nature of Rob's cheap and ill-fitting mask, Smaller climbers such as Yasko would have their vision severely impaired when they looked down or to the side. In addition, any head movement would have caused her goggles to fog up, or if she had taken them off, for the moist air to blow up over her eyes, significantly impairing her vision. But Krakauer told his readers the masks were state-of-the-art, a puff term that does not seem to be remotely accurate. The American team in 1963 used custom-molded masks designed by anesthesiologist Thomas Hornbein, who used one to climb the couloir, which now bears his name. The masks used by Rob Hall 33 years later aren't even close in quality and could not remotely be called state-of-the-art. As I have detailed in past videos, Krakauer is quoting an entire page from Rob Hall's marketing literature and using puffery language such as "Hall ran the tightest, safest operation on the mountain, bar none," have no place in a piece of supposed journalism. Apparently, Krakauer was unaware that in 1988, Rob Hall abandoned one of his clients on the mountain while he packed up his bags and headed back to Kathmandu. It's difficult to see how that was the safest thing to do, and I'll come back to that climb in a future video. More problematic is a financial arrangement between Outside Magazine and Adventure Consultants. Kasischke noted these problems. Rob Hall made his living as a leader of professional climbing expeditions. As such, each of us in the expedition knew that Rob's business interests influenced his decision-making. For Rob to seek publicity was not unexpected, but it was another matter in the extreme for Rob to form an alliance with the National Outdoor Magazine to actually embed a writer in the climbing team. That's exactly what happened, however. John Krakauer was embedded in our team specifically as part of a financial alliance between Rob and Outside Magazine. I'd never heard of that happening on a professional expedition. Never. From the first moment in Kathmandu, I learned of the alliance. I knew, without any doubt, that John's presence and purpose for being there would create major performance pressures and much added risk. This could have serious adverse consequences. This was, without a doubt, against the safety interests of the climbing members. Everest is already a very dangerous place without deliberately jacking up the risk. The entire extent of the financial alliance between Rob Hall and Outside Magazine will be covered in a future video, but for now I will point out that I agree with Lou Kasischke's assessment of the impact it had on the climb, and we can look at one very specific issue. As we are talking about the oxygen equipment, I'll discuss the problem that Rob Hall didn't have enough oxygen equipment because of the last-minute addition of a non-cash paying client to his roster. In addition to having limited oxygen, the specific problem for Kasischke was the lack of a spare regulator, an item commonly carried on commercial expeditions, and Scott Fisher's team was carrying one. This would prove decisive for Kasischke because his regulator was not working properly, and it likely cost Kasischke the summit. Kasischke writes, "My O2 canister was still, just as at the balcony, over half full according to the gauge. That told me the regulator or something else wasn't working." Kasischke confirmed he told Rob about this, and that Rob did not give him any backup regulator. "I told Rob again, as I had mentioned to him earlier when we were on the move, that my system was not working, that I actually felt better without it. Rob was aware I had taken the mask off for most of the time in getting to the balcony. He was an expert with this equipment. He fussed with the regulator and banged on the mask a couple times and said it should be better and to try again. According to my gauge, my canister is still over half full, I said. Good, that's great. Leave it in the bank, mate, and change it later. I had no explanation for why so much was left in the canister. I looked at the other climbers for signs that we were about to go and to see how everyone else was doing. Regulators breaking is a common problem on commercial expedition. Given that Kasischke clearly had a broken regulator, and he told Rob Hall about this, and Rob Hall didn't just say, go get the backup regulator, this is a good indication that Rob Hall's team didn't have a backup regulator. The problem occurred below the balcony, so all the guys were waiting at the balcony, and if any one of them had been carrying a backup regulator, Rob would have just told Kasischke to go over to them and get it. Despite this overwhelming evidence that Rob Hall's team did not have a backup regulator, Krakauer wrote in his 2025 Chapter 2, Tracy's allegation that Rob Hall's team did not have a backup regulator or reserve oxygen equipment is similarly false, and Tracy has likewise provided no credible evidence to indicate otherwise. The only people Krakauer is fooling with this is his subcult fan base that won't bother to watch my videos. Rob Hall wasn't using state-of-the-art oxygen systems. He didn't have a backup regulator, and his oxygen was stretched too thin to cover any emergency. If Rob Hall or any of his guides were carrying a backup regulator, they would have given it to Lou Kasischke, who was clearly having problems with his regulator. This is the entire reason you carry a backup regulator. But ever since the financial alliance between Outside Magazine and Rob Hall was made, it created problems for Rob Hall's oxygen situation. I don't blame Krakauer for what he did on the mountain. And I certainly don't blame Krakauer for decisions made by Rob Hall. I blame Krakauer for what he wrote in his book and his downplaying of the impact of the financial alliance between Outside Magazine and Adventure Consultants is certainly one of those things that both myself and Lou Kasischke criticize. Of course, Krakauer denies there was any influence from Outside Magazine, and he was just there to tell the truth. But now both myself and Lou Kasischke have demonstrated tangible biases in Krakauer's writing that massively favor Rob Hall, and it is naive to think that the financial alliance did not play a part in this. Turning to the next major difference between Kasischke and Krakauer's account, it has to do with the 1 p.m. turnaround time. Now, this is one of those things that is such a big deal that you figure there is no way Krakauer could fake it. Indeed, in my early videos, I had written off the issue with the 1 p.m. turnaround time or the 2 p.m. turnaround time as just being a result of confusion or altitude or something else. But once you look at it, there was no confusion. There was one person who fabricated a story. And it's not just me saying it, Lou Kasischke does as well. Let's break it down. Lou Kasischke was in the mess tent on May 13th, so this is just after they arrived back at base camp, and he is having a conversation about what happened. Groom was there, but couldn't speak. Kasischke just notes that Groom would make some gestures to ease off the discussion of what went wrong. It does not appear that Krakauer was there, at least Kasischke never mentions that he was present. And then later in the conversation, some people from another expedition would come into the mess tent, and Kasischke describes the following taking place. One of the Europeans, who could not have known Rob's advanced planning calculations, asked if 2 p.m. could possibly have worked as the turnaround time. The answer was no. We knew that 2 p.m. was not, and could not be, the predetermined turnaround time. But to speculate that it could have been was for some a means to cover up and put a better face on the actions of the late climbers. It is easy to obscure the true story by raising distracting questions. When you look at the total picture and did the math, 2 p.m. could not have worked in our situation. Now, Kasischke does not name exactly who these late climbers were, but we know everyone who climbed past 1 p.m. John Krakauer, Michael Groom, Jasko Namba, Andy Harris, Rob Hall, Doug Hansen, and the two Sherpa and Dorje and Norbu. Michael Groom has explicitly stated that the turnaround time was 1 p.m. in his book, so he was not doing any of the covering up. We can also rule out Namba, Hall, Hansen, and Harris. I'm not aware of Dorje or Norbu ever making any comment on the turnaround times. So that just leaves us with one person who appears to have invented a story that Rob Hall's strict turnaround time was not strict at all, and was left up in the air as to whether it would be 1 or 2 p.m. Unfortunately, I can't possibly cover every difference between Krakauer and Kasischke's accounts, but they are numerous and significant. There are people in various internet forums that claim to have read every single survivor account and claim that they all support Krakauer's version. They do not. It is not even close.